Bob Grosvenor has been working for 60 years now. His early sculptures, those dating from the mid to late 60s, often hovering in space, had to have been startling at the time, taking viewers by surprise. All these years later, his work still do. In that early period, he was imperfectly fit into the minimal category, despite the fact that much of what he made was anything but. It was nothing less than fantastical, at times exuberant, mischievous, mysterious. It still is, and now more than ever. If there's a through line in his work, it's him, his mind, his curiosity, his willingness to engage uncertainty. You might go out to his place, which I can only describe as an art yard, see something of interest, and ask him if it's a work. And he may answer by saying, well, I don't know yet. It's totally honest, deadpan, and you get the sense that he's interested in what you think about what's there. Art takes time, and Bob has never been in a rush. He makes things to see them, first and foremost. He himself doesn't always know, at least not in the moment, before he decides that he's satisfied with what he's done, if it will be shown. And even then, an exhibition is a test of sorts. Doesn't an artist see their work in a gallery as they hadn't in the studio and wonder, what have I done? The artist matters most in the final assessment, and the best artists are their toughest critics. I think of what Bob does as vehicles for thought. And not only the cars and boat-like sculptures, but everything, whatever form it may take. A younger artist who was recently looking at Bob's work, and I think he saw images of this car, said to me, artists like to turn old things into wild new things. That doesn't apply to all his work, but it does come to bear on the car in this gallery, the sculpture before us. Wild isn't the first word that comes to mind. There is a certain strangeness and elegance, and the sense that this vehicle, a conveyance for thought, has driven from the past to the present and will continue onward. This sculpture points as well to something basic to Bob's art. Paul brought this up just before we started. This sculpture points as well to something basic to Bob's art. It is what it is, and it's something else. It's what it was, and it has been transformed. Bob uses the term modified. It's before us now while encompassing other points in time. And something else, which should go without saying, but we need to be reminded of now and then, art has to be remembered. And if it isn't, what has been accomplished? I want to thank Davina and Paul for being here tonight, because talking about what Bob does isn't so easy. He himself has said, it's hard for me to speak about my work because it's so visual and it's sort of intuitive. So I asked them which works of Bob or which show or something he'd done was the one that hooked them. And Davina's going to go first because she has the first image. Do you know when this was made?
I think it was made before it was shown in this exhibition.
Oh, it was, because it was first shown in Paula Cooper. This is the Renaissance Society in Chicago.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I was first introduced to Bob Grosvenor's work when I was the archivist at Paula Cooper Gallery when I was, it was a while ago. And we staged 2 exhibitions by him while I was working at the gallery. And one of his first exhibitions was one of the first ones that I was working there for. And so the work made a big impression on me in a lot of ways. But I chose this image because I thought, I don't know, I picked 2 images because I had a hard time deciding, but they're related to each other. And there's things about this exhibition that continue in this exhibition, like the concrete, the cinder blocks being painted silver, and how the floor in here and the walls painted silver. And he put these walls in here in this space that create that horizontal horizon line, which works with the sculpture. And this found corrugated material with the skylight. And I had read this review about this show, and the reviewer was sort of describing each part of it and saying, kind of talking about how they didn't know what it meant. And I read in a lot of interviews that people ask him about them being shelters. And for me, like this piece, having the motorbike there, which is also not part of the show, which is something that I always love about his work as an artist. Like I just wanted to mention that in his kind of art yard, to get around, especially like he had a thing with his hip, he always has some sort of little, like a motorized thing, a golf cart or a scooter or something to get around to the little outbuildings and all. And I think he just saw it one day off in the corner and thought, oh, that might be something. And then I went when the show was being installed. His son installs all his shows. And Bob still, just before the show opened, said, I don't know, let me think about it. So they put it there and somehow it stayed there. But it's really a way for him to get around his place, like some kind of... But I love it there because the sculpture has this like posture, like the Sphinx type.
Well, it gives it a human scale.
Yeah, and it makes it, it's like, it's not, you could think about it and say, oh, is it a carport? People are so quick to like want to understand everything. And that's what I love about his work is
I thought it was like the Sphinx.
Yeah, that's
because
what I
also, you mentioned that the silver
skylight.
painted cinder blocks, it's only the ones in front. He really emphasizes just those ones
Front
that come
ones.
out low to the ground.
Yeah.
You have another piece?
The other piece is from a show at Karma, and this picture was, I think, the best because it shows the whole piece. But, in the last slide, like that piece having a skylight where like it's actually functioning as a skylight. In this gallery, you can also see the lights in there, and I just love this piece as like artistically. I feel like it's it's not I feel it, but like a reflecting pool. And for me, a lot of his work is kind of what you were saying, like a space for thought where, you're not looking at something that, like there's all this mystery in all of his exhibitions and things are built at a real scale. And this is built at the scale that it needs to be, like the last slide too. And I think seeing yourself reflected, seeing other viewers reflected, I don't know, it just feels like an emotional sculpture for me, like the dark water, so. And I think in terms of a lot of how he talks in other interviews about growing up and being really interested in this horizon and being interested in these flat landscapes, that this is just, I think the patina on all there's a real economy of materials in his work, and I think that because he's so interested in cars and has this like whole subculture of
And boats.
and planes and like showing things with this, like it's almost like the primer, but also dealing with color. When I saw this show, it's like all the paint and the found qualities and the patina on all of these concrete blocks, and then just having it be so, it's so simple. Just really drew me in. So
Paul, you mentioned you were still a student. I don't know what that'd be, like 66?
I was, it's a kind of story of involving Park Place Gallery, but when I was a student in Utah, and the school was actually, it's hard to believe, but in Salt Lake City at that moment in time in the 60s, the art department was quite radical. And it's where the Peace and Freedom Party was formed out of the art department. And a lot of students were very interested in minimalism. And there was a young faculty, and a lot of them had spent time in Europe, so there was a real emphasis in experimental films and experimental music. So this is through the period of 64, 5, 6, and 7. And so a number of my friends and that, we were interested in minimalism. At the same time, it's not like, there's rear view of what minimalism is now and how we think about it historically or in a history. at that time, minimalism, in my mind, occupied the same space as experimental film and Alan Capro and Frank Stella. So they were all something. It was all like an octopus of some sort. And we were aware of Park Place Gallery, but and I was very aware of Grosvenor, but I only knew of 2 works, but at that time, I don't know how many he had actually made, and one was the yellow cantilever piece, and the other one you did show, which is the vertical diagonal, I think it's called, I can't remember, it's a 65,
Oh, yeah.
that one.
This one.
That piece there. So these pieces had been publicized, I'd seen them in magazines, so, and we thought that Grosvenor would be there. As it turned out, he wasn't there. But we drove from Salt Lake to Denver to see Park Place Gallery. And they showed their films. And I think at the time, my friends that I was hanging out with were very much within the Donald Judd school, even the Clement Greenberger, more primary objects, but I was still kind of caught up with the body, so the minimalism I was making had a connection to the body, and I always was really interested in minimalism in the fact that you make a shell and inside now you've captured a void. And there's a space inside that no longer can be occupied or seen, and Dye or Judd or something. So I was sort of making these kind of pieces related to the body and then a kind of metaphor into, an object as a metaphor to the body. And I think there was a thing about Grosvenor's piece, which was the yellow one, which, for one thing, it was the fabrication of it. Like, I don't know whether I'd really seen something like that before. Yeah, there were bronze sculptures and public sculptures, but this big yellow thing that stretched across the gallery and
came out of the ceiling.
Came out of the ceiling and it was suspended off the ground. So it was a magical object. Like, it was a phenomena. Like, somehow it didn't touch the ground, and everything said it should touch the ground, but it didn't. The same as this one too, And just like, I think something about the fact in 1966 he fabricates these objects, which are really monumental objects and difficult to make. And I don't know who was doing that really,
No.
There's something to just that. And then the piece suspended in the air. It wasn't like a Donald Judd. It wasn't in the same mindset. And I was, hooked on Robert Grosvenor's work. From then on, I've always had an interest. And even though my work went a whole other direction, I guess you could say, but it's certainly, there's something.
He was
I'm interested in his work and have been since 1965. So.
He was happy to find out that you admirer of his work. He never knew. I want to show the piece that, I don't know if it's the first piece that I really, because I saw other things at Paula Cooper over the years, but I think, and this isn't at the gallery, this is in one of his spaces, but it's interesting, I think, to understand him as an artist who, he sees his work best where it's made. It has to be in the gallery or the museum because it has to be put out in public. But even when he asked me to come and see the car last summer, he said, oh, it's going to look much better than in the gallery. And it does. But I'll show you, we'll get to a picture of this at his place, and you'll understand, I think, kind of from what Davina was saying before, when he had those walls built to a certain height at the Renaissance Society, that he likes to create an architectural frame stage for his work to inhabit. And not everyone does that. But so this is probably the piece that really got me. It's 1987 to 89. It's untitled. it's the same as when you saw the yellow sculpture. I'd never seen anything like that. You also see how far he's traveled in 20 years, right, from the cantilevered pieces and hanging from the ceiling. But also, look at the way this just kind of sits just above the floor, because he added the 4 little legs at the corners. So, okay. This is the first one that made a lasting impression on me. At the time, I was involved with the sculpture of Katie Noland, someone Bob has always been very interested in, and for a while they showed at the same gallery. And I was making connections between artists of the mid to late 60s and those in the mid to late 80s. I actually started to have this kind of half-baked theory about this 20-year way that things came back around. But then, in the late 80s, you didn't see things 20 years later. It was kind of like a one-time thing, the way the 60s had this echo in the late 80s, which was you could mine it. It was very rich. So I was making these connections between people like Katie and Bob Grosvenor. So I felt he was as relevant for what he had done as for what he was doing then in the present, and it's still the case today. I paid attention to that. Here you also have a good example of architecture without architects. And that phrase comes from Bernard Rudovsky and Museum of Modern Art exhibition 1964, where we acknowledge the importance of the vernacular, and this relates to Bob Grosvenor, of structures improvised yet engineered. There's also the term that I know Bob likes, anarchitecture, which comes, I think, originally from Gordon Matta Clark. And that's where the kind of anarchic spirit meets architecture. And Bob has mentioned that. He's always been interested in architecture, but within a sculptural practice, not as shelter. That doesn't interest him at all. He built this to cover and better protect a trailer he had in this Brooklyn yard in Williamsburg. And at the time, Williamsburg, it's not the way it is today. It was rough. And if you had a trailer out back, and that's where he kept his tools and so on, they would be stolen. They wouldn't be there the next day. So he had this idea of covering it up with this thing, this gnarly thing, so nobody would think there was anything of value in it. Like, what would be inside there? Piles of rust or something. So the corrugated shell was going to be placed over the trailer. It would hide it. And who would break into that? Okay. But typically for Bob Grosvenor, he looked at what he'd done and he found it of interest in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And that became a sculpture. But that was its beginning. It had this purpose to serve. And then he thought, well, I like that. So that's my piece. And I guess, what are we going to do? Can pick up. So this is called Topanga. It's 1965. A lot of things you probably remember in the 60s, art magazines, so many reproductions were in black and white. You had no idea was there color, what was the color. So it was really a revelation to all of a sudden see how perverse it was that the different facets were, some were painted canary yellow and some were painted silver, right? So where this came from, and he's talked about this too, is he would see a picture in a magazine and think, oh, that would be an interesting sculpture. Let me see if I can build that. So this is what he had seen. And this is called the Kitts Peak Observatory in Arizona. And he spent some time in Arizona. And there's an interview where he said he saw the picture and he said, God, I can make this, and maybe it doesn't have to touch the ground. That's why the front end is like a couple of inches off the floor, like, oh, it's a levitation or something. So that was the first major decision for that to become a sculpture, that it won't touch the ground in the front. And it's a perverse choice. I never mean perverse with artists in a negative sense. In art, perverse can have a positive value, as we've seen in a lot of Bob's work. And this, sorry, I thought we were looking at the sculpture. It really looks small. When I looked at it, I thought it was a model. I thought, oh, but Bob doesn't make models. Anyway, it's, am I right? 10 feet high? Doesn't seem right. Well, let's forget that. So, but scale is part of subject matter, and he understands that. But often, like the boats, the cars, things like the shed, they relate to the body, as you were saying, your idea of sculpture related to the body. And that was something else. I think you were saying you saw this car as virtual.
Oh.
Did you say that? But the reason I bring it up is because in my notes, I said that sculptors only ever have, no offense to any sculptors in the audience, sculptors only have 3 moves. They can make something actual size. They can make it bigger. They can make it smaller. That's basically it. I mean, we're not talking about materials. We're only talking about scale. There's 3 moves. There's not another move left. And what Bob does, whether it's the same size as the thing he was looking at, or I think all of his work is actual size, because you're dealing with this thing in front of you, and that's where the virtuality or virtual, that's how I understood what you're saying. It's right there, we're there.
But I don't know whether I meant it that way. I think maybe I'll just read this little paragraph. I started off by the last sentence I wrote was, there was something about not wanting to read what others had said about Grosvenor's work. Not be influenced by others, hanging on to my own perception of the work, my own primary thoughts. And it has to do mostly with the car, I think. I'd also written, the work references and is a reconfiguration of what we have seen and what we know and what we have named. The sculptures are not of the norm, but are attached to our memories of our everyday life. In some way, they appear virtual, otherworldly. The sculptures, but what are they? It comes up, when I did read about his work, they keep saying, well, what is it? What are they? And I thought, that's a question, but I think we know the answer to what they are, right? We know what this is as a work. After that, there are things we can think about, but we know what that is. You could say there's a logic. The logic is the realm, let's see. You could say their logic is in the realm of the logic of a dream. Pretty sketchy getting out into dream stuff, but something there. What you expect is not what you get. And I think with Grosvenor's work, that's the thing for me. I knew I knew his work, and I remember I went into the Lyon biennial. We were both in the same show. And there was this small wall that was, and I think people probably have seen it. It looks like a garden wall with these sort of garden balls. Jeff Koons balls on it, right? Balls, yeah. In the 80s. But I remember walking in there and going, what the fuck is that? Like a real, like what is that thing? And I think seeing the car, I think I meant by virtual that, and then the walls being silver and the floor silver, something about it existing but not existing. And I don't know exactly, I kind of want to hang on to that. That's what I said. I don't want to read what you wrote because I want to hang on to the fact that when I looked at that thing, it existed but didn't exist. And it has to do with the thought that went in to make that. To make the floor silver, to paint it that color, to do what he did to that object, and to make that object the way he made the object. There's a perfection in it, and at the same time, it's such an enigma of some sort, as to what it is. But and that's what I meant by virtual, that somehow it did occupy some kind of space that is physical but not physical.
There's another element to that long stone wall piece you were just describing. So there are the gazing balls, which, and you have the stone wall, so it looks like garden or landscape. But at the end, there was this multi-pronged metal kind of antenna thing.
Yeah.
And you thought about that, like, what is that? No idea. But it looks like it's going to pick up signals from outer space or something. And there's definitely some kind of sci-fi aspect. Maybe that's when you mentioned the dream, it's not like a surreal thing, but it's like sci-fi, because sci-fi is basically, it's not the future, it's the near future, it's the present, but there's something recognizable but unrecognizable and unexplainable. That's like the enigmatic part of his work.
I think that I use the word dream, and it's sketchy, I know, but it's like that thing in a dream where you're in one space and all of a sudden you're in another space. And there was something about, that's Grosvenor's work, then all of a sudden it's not. It's something unexpected. I didn't see that one coming. Same with the car. I didn't see the car coming.
This is a piece that did not last very long. It's on Long Island Sound. It's called Floating Red Double T. It's another example of how I knew this piece from a black and white photograph forever, and it changes it if it's red. And you know that his red is a really strong red. So you have the horizon, the sky, the water, and then you have these things that have popped up. He's got them anchored there. They didn't last very long. But also, it looks very stable, but because of the wind and the water, they were kind of wobbling back and forth or performing the whole time, which he really liked a lot. And it's kind of the opposite of hanging something from the ceiling, this floating down or a floating up. That's 65 to 68.
Well, I think a lot of that too is like the stuff that's invisible, that you're not seeing. And like I was reading some things he was writing about making that piece, and he was talking about all the stuff that was under the water that you couldn't see, and how there was like a lot of it to get it to float. Mm. And I think that's also there in a lot of his work. It's like there's a lot there that, like in those pieces that don't touch the ground, there's a lot that's making it work that way. And so I think, I had the same reaction to reading the things I read, which it was like the question's always like, well, what is it? And he's like, and it remains mysterious.
He doesn't explain his work.
But it's like he likes how these things look. Like he has an aesthetic, and he's interested in these things that continue over many, many years. And so I don't know, as an artist, I found it really frustrating to read all these questions. Like the number of times he has asked, like, what is this? And it's like, it's a sculpture. It's an artwork. Like, what are you talking about? And yet there's a lot that you actually know what it is in his work as well. So I don't know.
He was once asked, do you ever think about the idea of living objects? And his response, oh, definitely, all the time. It's the life in some of these objects that really interests me. This is, where is it? Oops. I mean, check out the scale of this piece by the woman and the two children. I love this picture. This is Untitled Black. It's 1968. It's at the museum in The Hague in the exhibition Minimal Art, 1968. Why I love the photo is because I've always wondered, what did those kids think of what they saw that day? Which has to be completely unlike anything they had ever seen in a museum before. And do they still have the memory of that experience? I'm guessing that they're probably in their mid-60s now, or late. That was 68. I would like to think that they do remember that piece. They must, okay. And I think also there must have been kids who've come to this show and seen this green car sculpture. And I wonder if that's going to stay with them for some time, because they'd never seen a car like that before. Mm-hmm.
I also think, like, my son, whenever he sees an old-timey car, he's like, look, old-timey, and that's what he refers to every old-timey car as. And, like, his grandfather got him a little model of an old-timey car, and he plays with it with all of his, like, new cars. But you know, his reaction, this car is from such a different time than like what cars look like now and what the way that we think about cars now. And I think that now when you see a lot of, you know, when you see a lot of people work on cars, they will make them custom, but it's like flashy. And this car really is doing something else, you know, anyway.
I wanted to mention also, you can't really see it the way it's projected, but in the back, so it's 1968, it's show minimal art. So there's a stack piece of Donald Judd, and then there's this very low slant piece on the floor. There was something else over here, we're not seeing it. But when I looked at the photo, the first thing I thought about are these Judd pieces in the background, and you know, a lot of time has passed, and how normal they appear to us today in relation to the Grosvenor, which will never appear, it will never appear normal to anyone. And those Judds seem really well behaved to me, and it's also all these years later, but even in some sense corporate, and you can't say any of these things about Bob's work.
It's confrontational. It's very confrontational, like in the space. Grosvenor's work.
Yeah. So that's the cantilevered piece. 68 to 70, really important early piece for him. And this had been destroyed. A lot of early pieces, these built pieces were destroyed. But he's gone back a little bit now and then and had them remade. It was done for the show in Miami. It's 10 feet wide and it's 40 feet long. And you could actually stand under it. I want to get into some vehicles because of the car in the show. This is 1969. It's a three-wheeled car, and it can be driven. But you have to wonder about visibility because there's just that small diamond-shaped window inset into the visor hood that opens so a driver can squeeze in. But I don't know, how large could that person be? And the fact is it was originally made for his little daughter. He just made it for her to drive around in. And this says a lot about him. He said, it was impractical, but it looked good.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think he likes
and also
how these
just
things
hovers
look.
over the ground. It's another
Yeah.
thing he does
Yeah.
and has done for a long time.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's nice too. So I refer to it as more of a projectile, an object vector. And I found this nice quote for him. He said, "I'm attracted to shapes that can go fast."
Yeah.
Now that's a piece that you were remembered from Paula's and that I think was important for you. That's 86, 87.
Yeah, it was shown at Paula's again, I think in 2012-ish. But Paula also would sometimes like take things out of storage from artists that she was like either working with or not, and you know there'd be like a show. And so when I first heard her talking about this piece coming out, I didn't realize it was going to be his show. And when I saw that, I was living in Bushwick, and I was at the time casting a lot of concrete sculptures. And I was just like mesmerized that this piece was from the past, and that, not like the distant past, but just that it had been made, that I didn't know anything about it. It was so different from what I was seeing in galleries at the time. It was so different from anything any of the artists at her gallery were making. It was different from anything any of my friends were making. And yet there were these material similarities of things that I was interested in with the concrete, things that friends of mine were interested in. And I also got to meet Bob around this time, and it was just like, I don't know, I think just as a young artist, it's really meaningful to meet any artist who've been working for a long time. But yeah, this was going to be the piece I chose because it was just one of the first pieces that I really like got to spend a lot of time with. I mean, I was the archivist, but I would just see the piece every day over, you know, however long it was up. And
I'm not sure exactly what the starting point for this sculpture was, but really a major part of it is this big block of concrete.
He said it fell on that
He
chart.
said it was part of a wall and it fell over. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. I could do something with that.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about this piece, because also this is a period, it's 86, 87, and it went into the 90s where he was really, even people who liked his work and knew his work were just thinking like, what's going
What
on
next?
with Bob Grosvenor? Like, what is this? It has all these different elements. You know, you have the concrete, you have the blue tarp, you have these 4 discs. He doesn't consider them wheels. Then he had to build this structure to hold this kind of roof, this curving roof. And then there's another piece of corrugated that just hangs off the top awkwardly. In other views of this piece, it really looks awkward. But it shows you how he can take a number of elements, and it's about a coming together to make the whole thing. And it's almost like things that shouldn't belong together, that somehow, you know, parts to the whole. In his way of seeing, it does make sense. The thing I do want to mention, because this will come back to Paul to Utah, is that blue plastic underneath. He got that from seeing the way, like he would go out to the Bonneville salt flats and photograph the cars that were being raced there. And they would put these blue plastic or different plastic down under the car to catch any oil from dripping down so it didn't get on the ground. And he thought, oh, that's a good idea. And I think this piece might have existed for a while without it. And he didn't like it, and he didn't know what was missing, and didn't know what was wrong. And then he had that put underneath, and then he said, okay, it's done. You know, but it's definitely a coming together of elements that shouldn't work somehow, shouldn't have been brought together. So here we get into the way that he would create a piece specifically for Paula's gallery, which is, the room is 50 by 50 square. And you have to appreciate his thinking. To be able to see the elements of a piece, that's one work, how it would be seen in the gallery, he actually had a 50 by 50 foot square built out behind his place, and he had 3 walls around the side to approximate the gallery space. And he would put something there and look at it, and that helped him to understand, okay, does it work? Is it going to work in that, you know, in that space? But it was a real shift. Also, if you think about the piece we just saw, to go to this. So I think even people who were following his work would be surprised. And even Paula, who worked with him since 1969, he would surprise her. And I think that's significant. I only have one comment about this piece. It's two words: staging, staged. And I guess I almost didn't want to go there the other day on that Zoom thing. I have a problem with the way that certain critics would look at 60s minimal art and talk about its theatricality. I always thought that was just bogus. I thought that was just like, write what you want about what the artist does. It's in print, and then students come along and they read that, and then they repeat it and all that. I think for someone who is not a minimalist, I think that Bob is probably the one person who eventually, like by the late 80s, 90s, he's been working already a long time, since the 60s, created something like a theatrical situation for objects, for sculpture, on that stage of the gallery. Mm-hmm. I don't think the others did it.
You don't what?
I don't think the others did it. I think it was something that was written about what they were doing. I don't think it was coming from the artist directly, even if they could be interested in something like, you know, Beckett or something.
But do you mean staged in the sense of the gallery space? Do you mean that?
Yeah, he stages the object and he stages the architecture. That
in relationship to the space.
Yeah, but also, you know, when you see these photographs, the gallery hires someone, they come in, they take the photo. But when you go to see the show, you see people moving in and around it, and they become somehow part of that as well.
When I photographed his show, so like everything I could do became part of my role at the gallery, and I was photographing shows, even though I'm really not a photographer, but he was very particular about how this show was photographed. Like there was the show that had this big table with these white bags on it, and in the back was a separate element that was very far back in the gallery, and it had a cinder block, these cinder blocks and a long like fin that was fiberglass. And he wanted to take the photos so that the horizontal lines like were matched up. Like if you look at the photos on the gallery, you'll see it. It almost looks like the space is collapsed and like it's one thing, and then there's another view where you can see that it was very like, it wasn't, I don't know, I mean, I didn't talk to him about it being staged or not, but it was like, and in a lot of the photographs like of his work, it's very intentional. Like he likes how those photographs look. He likes how those things line up with each other. And I think that's how he placed the objects. I mean, I don't know, but that was my impression from watching him and like listening to what he wanted in the photos, was that he really cared about how those things lined up with each other and how they looked. And,
I kind of, I was thinking, the cantilevered pieces of the 60s and the scale of them and the monumentalness to them and how a viewer interacts with something that dynamic in a way. And you could say, I mean, I don't know whether the word aggressive is the right word, but the angles of them and the fact that you can stand underneath that thing. And I've always wondered, how perfect were they? Like a photograph doesn't tell you in a way, like how precise was that yellow piece or the black tea? And also the white piece that's hovering over the ceiling. And was there a wire? It seems there was a wire.
Oh, yeah, there had to be.
That held that one. But there is no wire, I don't think, in the black cantilevered tea piece or in the yellow piece. But I've wondered how perfect were they and how, because that is something to think about to some degree. I mean, I think it's really interesting how the car is painted and how the bottom drips.
Yeah.
And how there's an imperfection in the car. It's like the detailing stops at some point, but it seems very conscious.
Yeah,
Like
I
he's
feel like-
very aware of what those things are.
yeah, I feel like that detailing is like, that's intent, like that's like what he wants.
Yeah,
It's almost
like
easier
it's
to not
there.
do that,
Yeah, where he stops, how things end up at the state they are, but yet how perfect was the yellow piece. And then I was thinking when you were, like the subject of staging, and I think, for one thing, that the Grosvenor piece is coming out of the wall. I mean, he's using the architecture of the space itself. He's using the building to hold the piece. So that's pretty interesting right there, that he chooses to use the gallery wall to hold the sculpture and not the floor. The fact that it doesn't touch the floor is interesting, and when you think about the subject of the floor and minimalism and the use of the floor, or you don't use the floor, and the fact that he uses the wall but doesn't touch the floor, pretty interesting. But I also think, there was, at that period of time, I remember in the 70s, there was a thing of Home Depot became where you got your art supplies, right? Or there was a thing about starting to use these kinds of materials, found materials that were industrial or construction materials, and but yet that kind of move, that kind of, in every graduate school in the United States, there were sculptors using stuff they got at Home Depot or whatever, or the lumberyard down the street. But interesting because of that and how it navigated into the universities and into the art schools and into, but I think And I was thinking about, wow, looking at these things, and I think one really interesting thing is that he works outside. I think that's a pretty interesting decision, right? And these pieces, why he uses these materials and why he went in that direction to make these kinds of pieces is really interesting. The trajectory of Robert Grosvenor is really interesting. In the very beginning of the trajectory, that yellow piece, the Topanga piece, that piece itself given, and there were other artists in Park Place Gallery that, you know, what's his name? The Filipino, was he Filipino? I can't remember his name. Made these very paintings, these very dynamic paintings with parts that came off and went on another angle. And, you know, there was something about, I remember one time I was talking to Dan Graham, and I didn't realize, we both talked about Park Place Gallery and how important that was. How there are these other galleries, you know, Castelli, Firis, all this, but Park Place was an interesting thing in that it was a co-op of, I think, 5 painters, 5 sculptors, and 5 collectors. I think that's pretty interesting. But, you know, a collective art group, and yeah. So I think, Grosvenor and these, then you end up with these cars and the salt flats and the particular type, like it's a car coming from a car culture.
Right.
It's you know, it's coming from a type of customized hot rod type of car. So it's, which again is like, wow, crazy. That decision, another decision in there to choose that, like investing into this thing, something about, you know, using a car culture. But again, it's personal too. You know, in one way, me not knowing, like once you know that he's interested in that culture of cars, or he's interested in these salt flat cars, then that kind of changes things. You don't know how is he invested in his brain in these kinds of cars. But I think ultimately, I think it's the shape.
That's, I think he
It's
likes
the
how they
shape,
look.
the aesthetic of the shape.
You made me think of something when you mentioned the people modifying cars. They're not artists. They're into cars. They're doing.
Some of them are artists.
But
Some of them are artists.
Let me just make the point, because I mentioned earlier this idea of architecture without architects. And you could say there are all these people who are souping up cars and modifying them and altering them and so on. And it's like sculpture without sculptors. They're doing their thing. I wanted to put up this picture so you could see, and that's one work. The 3 cars comprise one work, and it brings us more into the present. This is 2012-17. Karma showed this work. But this is at Bob's place. And you can see what he built, right? To be able to put something in there to kind of frame it within a certain space. What I find interesting is the structure he built is coming from, and materially and everything, his sculpture.
Yeah.
But it's just meant to have this function to be a place to situate and architecturally frame. Because when I went there, he had one car that still hasn't become a work that he had parked in there sideways, lengthwise. And also, I forget exactly what these other elements were, but I could see that it was really not a resolved piece. I'm really excited to see what, if anything, he does with it. May not be anytime soon. But this is called 3-car unit. And as I said, the shed was built as a way not only to cover and hold things, but to see them within an architectural frame, a sort of proscenium. Now, we're going to see the same work at Karma in New York, and it kind of isn't the same work. So try to keep that image in mind. And maybe we'll just go back for a second. So that's in the gallery, and that's at his place. I mean, the distance of the camera is different, et cetera, but I think you see it. It's like, I want that piece, because it comes with this other extra.
Well, he showed a piece, I think it's in your slideshow, where he showed it in a container like that.
Oh yeah, that's coming up.
Yeah.
So this is the same work shown at Karma, and it isn't the same piece. This green car I saw in another shed near that one, which was more conventional as a garage, and it was just open on one side, and you'd look straight in. It looked different. In that garage type of container, it looked really like a stealth object. And because you saw it head on from the hood, it was going to come towards you. And that's how he was really looking at it. He didn't put it, there sideways. He put it in that long kind of container type of structure. And it was coming towards you. I just want to show you an interior of one of these cars, because this car, everything is sort of still there. But I think in all these cars, he really stripped out a lot of the interior. And it shows you, like you were saying, Paul, about the shape of things, that he's really seeing how the interior of a stripped car, how sculptural it is as a kind of the interior of a shell, right? So that's the interior of one of the cars. And you can see what he's taken. The dashboard's gone and all sorts of stuff is gone. And he took the carpeting out. And there's something even odd about that steering wheel.
I was thinking generationally how cars were different in the past. I think they were more about freedom, and there weren't so many people driving, and the cars were more aesthetic. And I think that I think he likes how they look. I think that there's a real interest in these things, and that being from a different generation, cars were so different when I was growing up that it I don't know,
Well, they become very samey in our time, boxy and samey.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people on the road, and there's a lot of traffic, and there's this expectation you have a car, and they're kind of plasticky now, and so it's the material of these is very sculptural, and the way he flips things around, and I don't know, it does seem like he's really interested in working with the cars as this fetish object, kind of.
So this is 2014. He titled it Aero Car. This was at Karma in New York. I just want to say, it can actually be driven. Do you see the propeller engine on the back? It can be driven, and it's scary. And I know someone who drove it down Great Jones Street, which caused a bit of a ruckus. So the person who drove it found the experience exhilarating, but keep in mind, there's very little support for the driver. There's this little tiny thing that you can sit on, and then something for the lower back. And you see to the right, there's one little tiny bit of a pipe that you have to balance your feet on. And I just want to mention there are no brakes. So Bob once
Fred Flintstone.
The brakes are my feet.
Yeah.
And another quote, and this says a lot about, I think, everything he's done. I've got this hobby making things, boats and cars. Until recently, I've always kept them at a recreational level, just having fun. And then this is scary fun. Look at this engine on this boat. Again, putting things together that shouldn't go together. This is 2014. It's untitled. That's a monster engine. It looks like a deadly weapon, rockets, guided missiles. And then this way that he contrasts things, very simply, the hard metal and this gnarly sci-fi thing against this soft wood and this idea of weight and weightlessness, and then this heavy structure, and then this almost like surfboard wings on the side. he had one description for this piece: really fast and very, very dangerous.
Is it functional?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And this is really, really unusual in his work. He never did anything like this before. This is 2018. It's also untitled. You know, unfortunately, this is kind of the best picture we found. But again, this idea of staging. When he showed this piece at Paula Cooper, it was in a side gallery, much longer than wider, with two openings. And the first opening you could go into because it was closest to the way you entered the gallery. And when you came into that room, you had no idea what it was going to be because you didn't see it from this side. You saw it from the back. So you saw the back of a kind of generic container, and then you walked along with, would be here, the right side. And as you got closer, there was just this golden glow coming out of the room. And then when you got all the way around and saw the open side, that's what you saw. Now here, it looks very yellow, but this is really gold paint. And there's a light at the back, which is basically illuminating this whole structure. I mean, I didn't even ask him, where did this come from? I just said, oh, that's a great piece, right? But it's an experiential piece. A photograph is just not going to, you had to be there. And this was shown only one other time. It was the last Venice Biennale. What's great about that glow is that it's alive and it eludes the camera. And, you know, I don't know if he, you know, I think he's going to listen to this later. I don't want to get in trouble. But I had one response to this piece when I first saw it. This gilding, the illumination, the red and gold contrast, a space we can access but not enter, except with our eyes, our mind, into the mystery. For me, it called to mind medication. I'm still a little jet lagged. Meditational devices, religious icons, and triptychs. Because you also think the original container would have these two doors that would open to reveal the interior. And I don't think he intended this association. I'm pretty sure he didn't. And I hope he doesn't mind that I said it, because I know that he does like, in all his work, to leave it open to the way people respond to it. Now, of course, I think he means that more to like the people who come and see it, not necessarily people who write about it. But that's my reading, that it really has this kind of religious, devotional, triptych, icon association. And now, the Bonneville Salt Flats. And I guess this is circa 1990. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And what's interesting, so this is around 1990, it's pretty much the same yellow as the piece in the cantilevered yellow sculpture you saw in whatever that was, 66. It's the same yellow, pretty much. And then here's where we see what he saw, which was the tarp under the car to catch any oil. And then finally, Bob's collected over the years a lot of models of different kinds of toys, cars, boats, helicopters, things like that. What I found interesting is, because when I wrote about it, I wanted to see them and look under and look at markings. And some of them have little plaques, like, it's almost parallels what, you know, Bob's doing, where some of these small models, well, wait, do we not have those pictures? We don't have those pictures. You just have to trust me. Wait a second. That's one of them. That's one of the models. It looks like it's full size. It's small. A lot of them were built by people who were working in the aeronautics industry in kind of the early, like in the 60s into the 70s, or they were working in automotive design. And maybe they were doing them for themselves or for their kids, but they really come out of this kind of tinkering, I mean, on another level, because they're people who are really building things and dealing with aerodynamics and speed and so on. But he has a big collection of things like this, and they're all amazing. But when I saw them, that's that's what really got me. I saw little things that I thought he had done to modify them, because they seemed like such Grosvenor touches, and he said, I didn't do anything to them.
Is it too loud? I just wanted to bring up the idea of the uncanny. It could be some of the things that Paul was saying, and you too, Bob, about the virtual and the dream space and the unconscious. And I feel like with this piece particularly, this is a Ford from like 1950, I think, and it's obviously a very iconic car from that time, from the Cold War era, the McCarthyism, and so it's something very iconic and very familiar to like Americana, but it's been altered. It's very unfamiliar, right? So I think that's the enigma a little bit that you know kind of related to that idea, and so it kind of for me evokes a lot of like the past or the kind of haunting or the ghost of the past. So I wanted to mention that and see if any of you had a response to that. And the other is that I thought with some of Grosvenor's work, it kind of relates to the Arta Povera, especially the use of some of the metal and the materials. And I was wondering if any of you could comment on that too. Thank you.
Well, about the second part, I was thinking about that, actually. I almost brought that up with the piece with the tarp, because I feel like a lot of, there's almost always something that like takes you out of it, like the piece you were describing. If it didn't have the balls and there's always something where there's this like other thing going on, where it's like there's an economy of materials and there is a lot of found materials and there is this relationship with Arte Povera, but there's also this like surprise material, like the plastics and these, and I think having like the thing for me with that Renaissance Society show is like that motorbike that's in the show is not part of the show. It's like it's not a skull. He said it's in the show, but he doesn't consider it part of the show. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, and there's actually
That's what
something
I was going to say about
outside.
your first question, or the first thing you brought up, which is that like in terms of that like post-war era, there's a piece outside on the building that's not part of this show. That's these two megaphones that are pointing out at the street, and they're very patinaed. They have like splatters all over them.
They look like
They're
they've
not
always
plugged
been
in.
there.
They look like from the same era as this car, but they're not part of the show. It's part of like the context. So I don't know. I do think it's very uncanny, and I think like what we were talking about before this talk was really organized was just like the mysterious, like the mystery alive in the work. But anyway.
Is the car, I mean, there is a photograph of a car in one of the books he has that is the same car.
That's
with
right.
the same.
Yeah.
So was the photograph of another car, and then as the same with the telescope, there is a very similar car, if not almost exactly, but is the car, I didn't touch the car, honest to God, but it's a metal car, right? Somebody tell me?
Yeah.
It's metal, okay, just to clear that up. But so it is an actual car that he's modified. He modified the car. He didn't buy the car, he modified the car. Correct?
Yeah, and the car he photographed precedes this by
Yeah,
quite
so
some
he's
time.
making,
So you had it in mind.
it's an image, it's the car as in its primary shape comes from a photograph of a car.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting,
Yeah,
right?
it is
Like that it's coming from an existing photograph, and then he's now gone and made a car, or chopped a car, did what he did to the car. I think the fact that comes from a photograph
There's a detail this
isn't,
car.
it doesn't come from his memory, but at the same time, I think it's a car, that type of car would have been a car, I mean, he's 80, so like chopped cars, you know, they are 60s. They're 60, you know, the subject of chopping a car, either the body or the roof is a 60s custom car thing, even though they exist now. But so it's probably, you know, it occupies in his memory as, you know, he's bringing something up from his past, I would think, it seems like.
There's a great detail in this car that I didn't notice the first time I saw it, but then I thought, well, maybe he hadn't done it when I first saw it. He'd done it between
After.
when I saw it and now that it's here. And when the lights come back on and you look inside, he sprayed the dash with a kind of glitter inflected paint. And you know, maybe if you're romantic and you have an association like I did, I thought, oh, it's like stardust. But I asked his son, and he said, well, Bob thought the interior was kind of dark, and he should lighten it up a little bit. So
Did he say
sprayed the
anything
glitter.
about the packing blanket?
I didn't ask.
Because I felt like there were some gestures that were just so like
Yeah.
artist speaking to artist or something, like, you know, flipping around the gas thing and like the packing blanket being like a very beautiful packing blanket and just having it out. Like the people I know, we're not that many, but like I know some people who work on cars and they would never have that kind of stuff like out in the car. It's a totally different aesthetic. So.
Any other questions or comments? Or not? Oh.
Can you hear me through this mask?
Yeah.
I guess this question is for all of you. How important is it that it's a car? And at what point does the car stop becoming a car? Like in a lot of, we've used the term car so much, probably more than sculpture tonight. And in a lot of the images you've shown, it looks like he's trying to eliminate pieces gradually until it's just right at that borderline of being recognizable as a car versus just being sculpture. And also, Bob, your comment about how they never look as good in the gallery space as they do in his studio or their original spot where they're created. Yeah, it's just sort of another gesture that removes a car from being a car. Like, this car is inside, it can't perform its function, so now it's just become sort of material, if that makes any sense.
All right, I mean, yeah, sure, it's the question, is it a car? I don't even think it has a motor, right? So, I don't know, but does it have a motor? I wouldn't think so. I don't think it drives, probably. The wheels turn. Yeah, so you pushed it in, right? You pushed the car in. So it comes complete, like it doesn't come in separate crates. It comes complete. Yeah, I think that thing of us referring to it as a car, and then of course it's a sculpture, and that's kind of what I was saying before, this thing of like the question of what is it, and we know what it is. It's a sculpture, and I guess we use the word car to describe it, and it's probably, you know,
Well, now
it's our bad habit,
it's a
I
sculpture
guess,
of a
or
car.
we're not thinking.
Yeah, I think it's like an accidental shorthand.
Yeah.
But you know, if you brought your son in here and said, what is that? Because you don't really need critics and curators. You bring a 5-year-old son in here and say, what's that? He's going to say it's a car.
They say
He's
old
not wrong.
timey. Yeah,
Yeah,
Say
but
that.
we're in a room full of
Old-timey.
people that aren't going to look at it that way, you know? Like, I think, yeah, a 5-year-old kid's going to look at it that way, but That's not,
Yeah,
we're
it's
talking
not his
about like,
audience,
well,
yeah.
who's the audience?
Yeah.
And what audience do we often talk to? We often talk to each other.
Well,
Right?
yeah, very much so. And I also thought about, like, I read this interview he gave with Storm King, and does not like putting the work outside. He doesn't like it getting weathered. He doesn't like people climbing on it. He likes looking at it. He likes how it looked. And so, I mean, I don't. I do feel like he's going to listen to this. So I don't know, but like this is just my, you know, whatever. But I was thinking about the last time I was like, oh, but he's like bringing this car inside, and like, what does that mean? And we had to buy a new car recently, and we're in the, you know, the dealership, and it's full of cars inside, and it's completely different than this. So I was like also thinking about that. It's like cars do go inside, and there's this collector I know who has a car club, and it's full of cars inside, and it's shocking. It's like, oh my God, it's like it's really unbelievable. But there's nothing, it's not even remotely like this. So this is such a sculpture, and when there's no one in here, like all those little weird things about it are very present because we're so used to looking at cars. So, I mean, when I picked the works that drew me in the most, they were not car pieces, and I feel like as a Bob Grosvenor fan, my personal favorite works are the ones that are a little bit less close to these things, but I do think that.
You mean close to particular associations?
Yeah, that's just my personal, like what I like the most. But I think it's still a car. It's hard to see it as not a car, for me.